This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
In 1971, Francis Moore Lappe wrote a book that transformed the way many relate to food called Diet for a Small Planet. Now, more than half a century and more than a dozen books later, Ms. Lappe is the force behind the movement called Living Democracy. It seeks to challenge everyday citizens to take active roles in their local and even national lives. Francis Moore Lappe is not your everyday activist, and she joins us for this edition of Bizgnus Interviews to explain why citizen involvement in government is more important than ever. For many of our viewers and listeners, your name is going to be very familiar because back in a long time ago, you wrote a book that has absolutely changed the world of what we eat. But today, Francis, we're not going to be talking about so much food, but about democracy. You're now moving into an area where a lot of people are very fearful that our democracy in this country might be at risk. Are we just people who should not be hiding under the bed, or what?
Well, in a sense, democracy I always think of as a journey and not as a destination that you can say that you're there. Democracy is a way of life that is ever evolving, and I think our understanding of it continues to evolve. But the idea of one person, one voice, the idea of all people being heard is never been fully achieved. But the more that our species evolves, to me, let me just say that democracy is the only way of life, of organizing ourselves that meets our deepest human needs for, number one, for a sense of agency that is power. It meets our need for a sense of purpose or meaning, and it meets our need for connection with others. Those three needs, and the only way of governance that meets those needs is democracy. So it's something that I don't think our species will give up trying for, no matter how many oppressors we have telling us, no, they know better than we.
247 years ago, give or take, depending on when somebody's watching or listening to this, we came up with a pretty decent form of representative government. But now it seems, if you look at the polling prior to the presidential election of 2024, it would seem that 8 out of 10 Republicans are supporting either candidate that's really into authoritarianism. Is that a thin reading of the polling, or do you feel that as well?
Well, I feel very worried. Because all the different forms of media, it's very hard to sort out truth and fiction. And so I have written a report on disinformation. That's something, that we could talk about, but that I think that's something that democracy, we really weren't prepared. Our forefathers could never have imagined, the world of Twitter. So I think we have a new challenge, and that is really understanding that we have to develop democratic ways to be fact-checking ourselves, and so that we are discussing and making choices together based on facts, not fiction, not the self-interest of someone who's made up a story. So it is a new level of challenge, and I think it is very, very connected to an equally important challenge to democracy today, and that is growing inequality throughout the world, especially in our society, economic inequality, economic inequity. Our country, we think of our, we've drunk the liquid or whatever, that, anyone can make it in our society. And yet the truth is that our income distribution is more unequal than in about 120 countries. And the top, 2%, 1% controls more than the bottom half or so. So, I just want to underscore how much that economic inequity challenges democracy, because it leaves people very vulnerable, because there's so much stress and people are so distracted by just trying to make a living, much less to keep up with what's true in the world. So there's a lot to talk about that part of the new world we're in.
Let us first talk about economic inequity and how to balance it out a little bit better, if not solve it entirely. And then I'd like to get back to the disinformation, misinformation that so threatens everyday life. But first, economic inequity, and now I give you the magic wand. How would you solve it?
Well, there's not one solution. It is first recognizing that this is not inevitable and recognizing how extreme it is relative to the past. So that's one of education. But it's also understanding that everything from, the power of labor to organize has been threatened. And we've enabled the concentration of corporate power so much so that now just, a handful of corporations in almost every sector control so much of that arena, that real competition that would keep prices lower, that would diminish some of the inequity, that's much more difficult in a society where just fewer and fewer corporations dominate each sector. So I think labor, reinforcing the right to organize and protecting labor rights. I think we used to have a standard to antitrust was something that was not, it was not simply a liberal idea. That was a very much part of our history, that we understood this antitrust, meaning trust referring to corporations, was understood to be essential. And I think that many countries have a floor under people, so that that gives them a greater sense of they don't have to just work for virtually nothing. And so a universal basic income is another strategy that some have taken, that I think makes tremendous sense, the survival income that nobody can fall beneath. So there are a lot of approaches that we can learn from. And but we've got to let go of this idea that somehow we're the best, and that the free market is really free, because it isn't.
Before you can persuade people to change life, society, the economy, whatever, you have to provide them with facts. And that's where disinformation and misinformation is such an evil snake ready to strike. How do you, while maintaining freedom of the press, freedom of speech, how do you control that?
Well, I've written a small book. It's called Crisis of Trust: How Can Democracies Protect Against Dangerous Lies? And there's one country that was my hero in this, that is so, in a way, when I tell you what they do, it'll be pretty commonsensical. The country is New Zealand. And New Zealand has dealt with the crisis this way. They have a distinguished board of people who are widely trusted throughout society as their kind of almost like, their overall overseers of this system. And it's completely transparent. So you can go online, particularly for broadcast news, you can go online to, a website. And if you hear something that you think is both false and dangerous, you can write about it, and it will be there for everyone to see. And there's this panel then has to look into it and judge whether or not it is in fact both wrong disinformation, and it's dangerous. And then are they are empowered to remove it. And when I was writing this report, only 7% of the of the complaints ended up in removal, which shows you, I think, great deal of restraint that free speech is still alive in New Zealand. But I also think that if we had something like that here, that would deter the problem from happening, because nobody wants to be nailed, for spreading disinformation. So I think it's a deterrent as well as a fix. And there's a report from New Zealand, and they don't think it's perfect, and there's no perfect solution. But I just thought that was really, commonsensical way of proceeding: transparency, participation, and evolving so that it continues to correct itself. And I'll just give you one example. There was a show on television that spread disinformation about COVID, and there was complaint from the viewers, and then the authority said, okay, next week, same time, same station, same program, you've got to give the correct information about COVID. So it's, very like, oh yeah, that's a good solution. And and again, I think it's probably deterred people knowing that somebody's watching. So I think there are ways that the strongest protectors of freedom of speech can probably agree that something of that order that was transparent and and very careful, that could work. And so I want to spread the news about that.
Well, it's an interesting idea, but I despair at ever being able to name a panel that everybody would agree is a good, disinterested panel. I mean, Walter Cronkite's dead.
Right. Most people never heard that name, right?
I think you and I are of the age that we have heard of
Yeah.
it and have seen things change. I wonder what Cronkite would think about TikTok and all the other stuff, but
Yeah,
I
it
guess
is
we
a
can't
different
quite bring
world.
him back. So how do you get corporations to behave in an information age? And I'm speaking specifically of the Fox Corporation, which lost a gigantic libel suit to
Hmm.
a voting machine making company, uh, and uh,
Hmm.
and yet they
Yeah.
still have essentially the same type of programming. It hasn't seemed to deter them.
Well, I don't pretend to have an answer, but I do know that this discussion we're having, we should all be having with our families, with our kids, and uh, in the classroom, because we have to introduce this as an extremely important issue. There is no single magical answer, but to educate our children and our youth, all of us, that this is, how this is progressing. And I don't know if you know, but some time ago, President Biden set up an office to try to confront disinformation, and immediately it was attacked, and the woman who was put in charge of it she was out the door, and that there was a lot of intimidation. So I think what we can do is to continue to identify this as a crisis, and to point to how real democracies, New Zealand is not a totalitarian society, and they've managed it because it is transparent and participatory. And I think that approach is the way that we must proceed. So I think, that all parents can warn their children about, don't believe everything you see on social media, and you know, do your own fact checking when possible, and don't spread things unless you know that are inflammatory, unless you know that this is an accurate representation. So I think recognize it as a crisis for democracy is first, and then using our common sense, and hopefully in the future we can actually agree on some policies as they have in a country like New Zealand.
Is it possible that this could be solved by non-governmental means, by companies taking a more proactive approach to overseeing what their products are?
Well, in theory, but the sad thing for our species is that lies travel faster than truth because they're often inflammatory, and we know what shoots around on Twitter or something is something that's really So that's the problem. That I think it has to be publicly agreed upon rules because people, unfortunately, if they're just individual groups, they could see it in their interest to continue the inflammatory speech. Um, and the public is all of us together are what is harmed. So I do think it has to be a public process.
You seem very optimistic and positive. How do you manage A, to get to that point, and B, maintain it?
Well, I want to tell you, I do not call myself an optimist. And that's pretty hard in today's world. So I call myself a possibilist. And what I mean by that is that I observe life on Earth as all is connected and all is in continuous change. And in that's the nature of life. And so it is not possible to know what's possible. And many of the things that have happened in my life, I would never have predicted. I grew up in the segregated South. I went to all segregated schools. I just wrote a piece about how our church was investigated by the FBI because we had African American members of our church in Texas in the 50s, and they equated communism with interracial. And so that, at least we're not we're not, having the FBI go after church members because their churches are interracial. And also a friend of and one of my extended family during the Korean War, he said that he had volunteered for the Korean War and was the Army said he couldn't join because he was a member of the NAACP. So we have progressed. And so I really think it's absolutely important, essential that young people understand the barriers that we've overcome, and therefore the belief that deep, deep change is possible. And that's why I say I'm a possibilist.
Oh, I will take that as a semi-optimist, I guess. But how do you get the message to students and younger?
Well, social media, certainly we're doing our best. I was struggling with a tweet this morning about really these questions of disinformation. So I think certainly that is one way. And we have, we try to do our part here in our office because we have young people, college students working here with us as interns and sometimes paid when we can. And it's just so inspiring to me how many young people want to really, really go deep and to not just, I mean, it's lovely the people who are volunteering for soup kitchens and that sort of thing, but also young people who want to really understand and go to the deep policy roots, structural roots. And so I guess that helps me stay in possibilism because I work every day with young people who demonstrate that sense of possibilism. They've not given up, and they're very, very bright and very gutsy.
Now, could you tell our listeners and viewers where they can get more information?
Oh, easy. It's easy to remember. It is just small planet. The idea of small is just that we're all really closely connected. Smallplanet.org. And we have many books that I've written there about all the things we're talking about. We have Twitter, of course, social media stuff, but we have, I'm just now working on a blog. This will all be on our website, a blog about affirmative action as the Supreme Court has decision so affects admissions. So I'd love any of you listening to go to our website and sign, get on we have a newsletter and our Twitter feed. So that would be terrific.
Frances, you've been great with an awful lot of wonderful ideas, but what would you like to add that we've not yet had a chance to talk about?
Well, I like to think and remind myself daily that that at the root of all is courage. That our species, the good and the bad, is that we are herd animals and we love to stay in the group, and it's really scary to break from the pack. And so I'm saying to all of us, and this is me, I'm talking to myself too, but that to break with the dominant way is scary. And so I suggest that anyone listening who just is kind of feeling, to find just one buddy that it's hard to do things completely by ourselves. So find a buddy and then think of something that you thought you could not do. And because if you do one thing you thought you could not do, that's going to give you more sense of courage for the next thing. And so also my little gimmick that came to me when I was scared to death to raise my hand in an audience with Al Gore speaking, and my heart started going like that. And I was really scared to raise my hand. And I said, oh, I think I'm going to start renaming that my inner applause. So if next time your heart is beating with fear, think, well, maybe your heart is telling you, boy, go for it, go for it. It's applauding your courage. So I think courage is a virtue that is not talked about enough. And courage is not just physical courage of confronting an enemy in a battlefield. It is risking being wrong, risking losing a friend. It's, we're, as I say, we're group animals, and it can serve us, but can also hold us back. And so we have to risk being wrong. We have to risk maybe losing part of our social group. And that, the good part about it, other people will start coming toward you who are want to support your new courage. And so that is what keeps me going.
And it sounds like it could be the topic of your next book.
Yeah, well, I did write a book with a young man called You Have the Power. They wouldn't let us put it, we wanted to call it something with fear. What was it? We called it Fear Means Go. Fear Means Go. And the publisher said, no, Americans are too afraid to buy a book about fear. So it's called You Have the Power. But it really is about this idea of, and it's still available, you Have the Power is about transforming fear into energy for change. And I wrote it with a man about half my age, and so it really is two generations speaking.
You've been watching the Bizgnus Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.